Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our annual Backus lecture series. My name is Dr. Amelicheva, and I am the director of the Center for Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies. I'm trying to be environmentally friendly here, so it is again my pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Backus lecture. Funded very generously from the Backus Visiting Lecture Program in Polish Studies. This lecture series was established in honor of the first director of Russian and then Soviet studies at KU in 1960s, Oswald Backus III, who, having finished his PhD in Russian and East European history at Yale University, arrived at the University of Kansas with his family in 1950. He was the one who was able to secure funding in support of the growth of this program in area studies. And this lecture series is, of course, in his honor. It is supported by Center for Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies and Professor Emerita in History, Anna Chicheva. And I'm going to say just a few words about Anna, Dr. Chicheva, and she will be introducing our speaker this evening, Krystyna Piórkowska. Professor Chicheva was born in Gdańsk, the former Danzig. She studied modern European history in England, Canada, and the U.S. She obtained her PhD in 1962 from Indiana University, Bloomington. She came to KU in fall of 1965, and she has taught courses in modern Eastern Europe and Russian history until her retirement in 2002. Modern Eastern Europe and Russia until her retirement in 2002. Her specialization is in the history of international relations with emphasis on Polish foreign policy in the period of 1914 to 1945. And I would like to pass the visionary mic to Dr. Chicheva, and she's going to introduce our speaker, Krystyna Piórkowska.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure, a great pleasure and privilege to introduce to you a most extraordinary person who is not only a scholar in history, but also a successful businesswoman in New York. But it's about her historical work that I want to speak. And that is, she has been interested in the Katyn massacre, which some of you probably know, was a massacre of Polish officers taken prisoner by the Red Army and executed in the spring of 1940, then discovered by the Germans in 1943. Krystyna Piórkowska is an extraordinary historian. She has a detective's eye for the details. And the devil is in the details, what I'm saying. So she picks out details and she goes, as in this case for instance, to visit the families of those American and one English and two British witnesses to Katyn who were held in German POW camps and who were brought by the Germans to look at Katyn. I think it was in May 1943, in April was the discovery. And she goes and she finds materials in the archives that people just didn't know existed. She found, for example, that two of the American officers whom the Germans took to view Katyn were actually had ciphers. They ciphered the news about Katyn back to the American intelligence through, I think, letters or ciphers or both, the families, right? So that the American government knew almost immediately what was there, and that everything pointed to Soviet guilt in this matter. And she has been pursuing this. She went to visit the families of these officers. She went to the archives, and she's continuing her work. This little book, bilingual, by the way, English-speaking witnesses to Katyn, recent research. This is the English side, this is the Polish side. We have it in the library, so if you look under her name, you'll find it. And she's working, I think, she will be an expanded edition later, right? So,
if somebody wants to publish it.
So now, without more ado, I will ask Krystyna Piórkowska to tell us about some of this research.
I hope that you will talk louder than you will.
I said, or whether I should speak more loudly.
Yeah, both.
Okay.
First of all, hands up in the back. Do you hear me loud and clear?
Yes.
Okay. So, firstly, thank you to the university for inviting me. Thank you to the Backus family for funding this lecture series. Before I start to speak, I'm not sure I exactly deserved the words of praise that Professor Cięciała gave me, but I think it is fair to mention this evening, and in fact it's a necessity to mention, that Professor Cięciała will be observing her 85th birthday in a week. And when we end, hopefully we'll sing happy birthday if there are enough of you that make it through this lecture and have the patience and the strength. So, before we start dealing with the matter specifically, I wanted to show you this image. I couldn't correctly download it into my presentation. It is the monastery in Kozhevsk. Kozhevsk was one of not just 3, but a multiple of camps where Polish prisoners were held, Polish POWs were held, and from which they were taken to the various execution sites. This obviously is a renovated rendition or image of the monastery, and unfortunately in renovating it, one of the things that would have been additional documentation to the information about the massacre was the fact that in the monastery, just in many European houses, you had huge high tile stoves. And the prisoners, before they were taken away, scratched into the walls dates, numbers, and words, direction unknown. Date, number, and direction unknown. Because the prisoners were taken out over a lengthy period of time. So, having now allowed you to see what the monastery in Katyn looked like, let me now, as I start my lecture, ask you, how many of you knew about Katyn before you walked in? What do you know about Katyn? No. A bit. Okay. So we're not totally starting out from ground zero. The question about the English-speaking witnesses arises from the question of when did the United States and Britain know of Soviet guilt for this massacre? The fact is that until 1992, the United States, or even in 1992, the United States was able to write to the son, Franciszek Herzog, of one of the executed prisoners, and state that it was not clear. There was not documentary evidence as to who had committed the crime. And so one of the things that Professor Cięciała worked on, which is a book called Katyn, a crime without punishment, is the fact that there is a Katyn lie, the Soviet Katyn lie. But the Soviet Katyn lie was not the only lie. It was a US lie and a British lie. So we'll start very quickly. August 23rd, 1939, Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. The Soviet Union is an ally of the Germans. For a period of almost 2 years, they aid and abet. And as a preacher in the South would say, had they not done this, the war would have been very, very different. We'll go into more detail about the various points here, but this is an image of pre-war Poland. As you can see, it has a very different shape from current Poland, which is more squarish, and it has this long leg that goes up near Lithuania and Latvia, and that is also of great importance to the remaining group of officers that survived, because they were, in fact, interned in Lithuania. And that's why they were not executed in April and May of 1940, when all of the other people were executed. So, this was a non-aggression pact. Everybody knew it was a non-aggression pact, but there was a secret codicil which included a map delineating exactly how Poland was going to be split, how it was going to be partitioned. And so the war starts September 1st, 1939, but on September 17th, the Soviet Union marches in from the east. And that is why some of the officers were retreating to the east into the areas of Belarus and Ukraine, and others up towards Lithuania. And it was the ones who went into the areas of Belarus and Ukraine that were taken POW by the Soviets and then executed. The demarcation line. There was no Poland after the 28th of September. The western parts of Poland were incorporated into the Third Reich. The remaining portion was general government. The eastern section was incorporated into the Soviet Union. And the peoples, or the people of those eastern borderlands who were Polish, were in huge numbers transported into the midst of Kazakhstan and other stans where they were placed on collective farms. What is then the Katyn Massacre? It's a series of executions. Polish, not just officers, but border corps, rangers, prisoner guards, police, anybody that you could think of who could be knowledgeable on weaponry. And it is called the Katyn Massacre because the first site to be discovered and the first site to be announced was in the location of Katyn. These were the prisoners who were held in Kozhevsk and transported to Katyn, executed and buried there. As you see, the order is issued on February 28th. That was just this summer determined. Sorry, we're going to go back to that for a second. And by Natalia Lebedeva, who was able to confirm by numeration of documents what the date of the order was. And they were transported, as I said, from the 3 former Orthodox monasteries to Katyn, Mednoye, and Bikovnia. There were other camps, and there were prisoners who were killed in other locations. We know that there are 4,700 more or less men killed in Katyn. We say now that there are 24,000 victims, 4,000 or over 4,000 of whom are on what is known as the Belarusian list. These were people who were executed on the territory of probably a place called Kuropaty near Minsk, and the Belarusians and the Russians refused to release that list. Why is Katyn important to Poland? Well, to the world it's important because it's a violation of the Hague Convention on how you treat prisoners of war. It's the first time that such a huge number of POWs gets executed. Remember, in the First World War, when officers were killed, they would actually be buried very often by their opponents in very formal ceremonies in recognition. I'm not saying it always happened, I'm just saying it was still a tradition. Then the other reason that Katyn is important to Poland is because it is followed by the arrest and the transportation into the depths of Russia and of the families of these victims. It involves also the arrest of the intellectuals of the eastern borderlands and their sentencing to the gulags. And it creates a huge vacuum in society. Your intelligentsia, your experienced people, your professors, your doctors, your engineers, everything is gone. And then the Katyn line. Not only the Soviets, not only Britain and the United States, but in Poland, you're not allowed to say your father was a victim of Katyn. As a result, you cannot properly mourn them. If, when you go to college, you fill out a questionnaire and you have to fill out a family biography and you put down that your father was an officer and he died in 1940, well, hello, you don't get accepted to college. So it creates a whole vacuum. So Britain and the United States claimed that there were no reports or testimonies from third parties, from people who were neutral observers. All of the information, they said, was coming into them from Polish sources. Józef Czapski, who traveled around Russia after Operation Barbarossa started and after the Soviets became allies of the Americans, he collects reports. The remaining officers who survived, that small little group of 400 from Lithuania, 400 that were held in Grazowiec, they start creating name tallies. Whom did I know and who's missing? And all of this starts to be submitted. And the Americans and the Brits say, but that's not clear who that is. But the British and US witnesses were impartial. They didn't have Polish, Russian, or German roots, per se. If they did, it's quite a ways back. And in this way, determining precisely what they attested to, and the first day they did it, would help clarify things. These maps were borrowed, and I have to give credit to Wikipedia because I couldn't find a clearer map, but it shows you the transportation routes from where they were taken to the massacre sites. Here, this is a little bit difficult. I hope this will stay up for a moment. One of the other camps that existed right around here, and it was called Putyvl. And I'll mention it to you later when we're talking about the document that I discovered in November of 2013. It was a transit camp where Polish officers were held. So, this is a quick summary of the basic 15 reports that the United States and Britain had received. And these were pretty clear reports talking about, well, we knew that these men were taken prisoner. They were getting letters from, their families were getting letters from them. And then suddenly, in April of 1940, all correspondence ceases. The families were sending requests through the Red Cross. Nothing was happening. But all of this information is being collected. The military attaché who's attached to the Polish army, which was created in Russia and now is in Cairo. He collects information, he submits it to Washington. George Marshall, General Marshall, demands a report. The same officer, Colonel Szymański, prepares this report and sends it into Washington. And Owen O'Malley, he is a British ambassador to the Polish government in London, writes a report in which he makes reference to the little conifers which were planted on the graves to conceal them, and that if Britain proceeds to do similarly, we will be doing no different than the Soviets who planted these conifers. there were communications sent by the POWs, and I'll talk about them, to the Swiss protecting powers. And finally, when we get into 1944, there will be three things that are important. Ambassador Harriman's daughter went with a group of Western journalists to Katyn when the Soviet Burdenko Commission was there. And she wrote up her version of reality together with John Melby, and that was submitted to FDR. And in May of 1944, George Earle, who was stationed in Istanbul, sends in reports, which he's not clear on where he got them from, and they're different from the other reports, and he is persistent that it's the Soviets that did this. So why would the United States not have wanted, and I'll hopefully be through with my little introduction in a moment, why would the United States not have wanted to admit it? Well, clearly, the Soviet Union is supplying the cannon fodder. We're supplying the materiel, but they're supplying the cannon fodder. And so FDR has a clear perception of what is going to happen. And he meets with Cardinal Spellman, who is his emissary to the Mediterranean basin and to the Vatican and so on. And on September 2nd, 1943, just after the Quebec Conference, he states, Poland, if it exists. He also says the Europeans will have to become used to the communists. And it will take several generations for this to occur. And one of his great quotes is, and we cannot deny the great economic achievements of Joseph Stalin, which blew me away. So, the prisoners are taken, or the men are taken prisoner in September of 1939. Some of them live through May of 1940. We'll talk about that in detail. We'll talk about the announcement of the Katyn massacre. We'll spend a few moments talking about the Technical Commission of the Polish Red Cross and the International Medical Commission. Very often when you look at information that's published or even on the internet, they'll talk about an investigation by the International Red Cross. No, there was not one. And we'll talk about the Wehrmacht and the Division Azul soldiers. The Germans were very clear in their propaganda. I didn't want to upload one of the posters, but they produced posters about Katyn showing a soldier who had been massacred, and those were distributed throughout the POW camps in Germany. So, as I've mentioned, they've been writing to their families. The NKVD is taking the addresses of the families from the correspondence. That's how they create the database of people that they're going to arrest and take into exile. In fact, at one point, the Polish Red Cross is told to prepare a repatriation camp in Warsaw, and that doesn't occur. They're then told to just close it down. So there was an expectation that these men would be returning. On March 31st, 1943, Germany formally learns about the existence of Katyn. I say formally because the Germans were in the Smolensk area since the fall of '42, and it is very highly probable from other correspondents that they knew about the existence of the Katyn graves. There was a question as to when to use this information and how to use it. So, March 31st, 1943, there's a formal letter that's placed into the records, and then Goebbels writes in his diary, this is going to be great. It's going to break up the alliance of the British and Americans with the Soviets. On April 9th, the Germans allow or ask a Polish delegation to come. The Polish delegation has permission from the Home Army, the underground government of Poland, to go to Katyn. And then on April 10th, the first group of foreign reporters arrives. The visit of the Polish delegation is important in that the Germans were already exhuming bodies under the direction of Dr. Backus. They had Volksdeutsch working for them who were transcribing the names, and there were a lot of errors being made. And when the delegation came there, they came back and they said, you know, they're really messing up these names, we've got to get this straight. And a decision was made that a technical committee would be formed. We'll talk about the technical committee in a moment. This is one of the publications of the Germans during the war. It was in color. Your pages were formatted in a very interesting fashion. Each page had a different sequence of columns, different size photographs, images, maps, and so on. It was not standard run-of-the-mill, and when you think about them doing this in some 24 languages, you realize what a technical achievement it is to have done this in the midst of wartime, and printing in color when most magazines were still not being printed in color. This image shows Kiselev, who was a local resident of the Katyn area, and in the background, the gentleman in the Humber is Dr. Nabil. He was a Swiss forensic specialist. So, April 2nd, Radio Berlin announces the discovery, and Transocean puts out a press release, and they discuss 10,000 bodies. Why 10,000 bodies? Because that's the number that the Polish army has been talking about and saying is the number of officers missing. Immediately after that, all of the press picks it up. It's on the front pages of the newspaper. And on April 17th, the government of Poland requests that the International Red Cross visit the massacre site. The Germans also request that. The International Committee does not respond to the Poles, but responds to the Germans saying, well, we can't send anybody to investigate the site because Russia would have to agree to it, and they're not agreeing to it. So we suggest that you create a committee of acknowledged forensic specialists who will go to the site and investigate it. And then on April 20th, the second group of journalists, mainly Central Europeans, visit Katyn. Immediately after that, the Polish ambassador to Russia, it's Holy Saturday, the night of Holy Saturday to Easter Sunday, gets called in around midnight to the Kremlin, and he's advised that, whoops, we're severing diplomatic relations with Poland. The International Medical Committee comes in on April 28th. On April 30th, they issue their report. And they confirm that based on everything they've seen, calcification within the skulls, and other physical changes, that these bodies have had to have been there for 3 years, and not as the Soviets have alleged for 1.5 years. Because the Soviets immediately came out and stated that the murders had occurred actually at the point in time when the Germans took control of the area. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the Division Azul, and the Charlemagne Division are brought in such huge numbers that Dr. Wojcinski of the Polish Technical Committee of the Polish Red Cross protests. He says, we can't work under these conditions. It's disrupting. We've got to stop everything we're doing when they come in. And they sort of come to this agreement that visits will only be allowed at certain points in the day. And sometime in May, Polish POWs are also brought to the site. But the date that we're concerned with is May 13th, when the forced visit of the English-speaking witnesses occurs. This happens to be the document issued by the by the Germans, containing the report of the International Medical Commission. It is interesting in the fact that each and every one of the members signed it, and the Germans photostatically reproduced it, and produced it in 3 languages. Again, during the wartime, doing this on a 3-day turnaround, that's, gotta give them credit. They knew how to get their printers working. So how well known was the issue of Katyn in the United States? the Russians, the Soviets, had a illegal station in Washington. It was headed by Kombrich Zagrubin. He used a different name while he was in the United States. And he sends a cable, which is decrypted as part of the Venona papers. It's sent around July 3rd, 1943, and he writes, I know, they're following me. They're following me. They know I was in Kozhevsk. Now, if anybody's been in the army or worked with trade secrets or anything else, I don't care how encrypted the material is, you don't use that word. You'll say, oh, you know, I'm really feeling ill. You know, that surgery I had in the Smolensk region, it's not doing well and I need to come back. Something like that. But using the word Kozhevsk, he had to have been freaked out completely. And who were the English-speaking witnesses to Katyn? What did they do with the information they had? Were there intermediate witnesses? One of the intermediate witnesses was Henry Szymański. There are going to be 4 West Pointers that I'll be talking about tonight. And Henry Szymański was part of the US Olympic team in Antwerp in wrestling. He also is probably the only person aside from Tadeusz Kościuszko to have issued orders at West Point in Polish, although I doubt Kościuszko used Polish, probably spoke French. But he kept copies of his reports that he collected and prepared during the war. He was never penalized for this. This became public during the Madden Committee because they were the source. His reports were his copies were the only sources for these reports. The second intermediary witness was George Earle, whom I sort of mentioned earlier. He had contact in Istanbul. Yes, it was cloak and dagger, just like you see in the movies. And he had contact there with people who were in the anti-Hitler movement. And it's not clear what reports he had or whom he received them from, but they appear to be different than the other reports that existed that we know of. And then another intermediary witness and a West Pointer was, of course, General Lawton Collins, Lightning Joe Collins. And he was the first high-ranking U.S. Army officer to receive a report on Katyn. There was Arthur Gillis Lane, who was the post-war U.S. ambassador to Poland, who resigned his post in protest. There was Julius Epstein. He's the focal point. He starts the entire investigation in the United States by his articles that appear in the Herald Tribune. And he says, there was this murder, we need this massacre, we need to find out what really happened. General Clayton Bissell, many of you have read about him as being the one who received John Van Vliet's May 22nd or 23rd, we're not sure of the exact date, report. And that's, sorry, that's a typo, that's not 15, that's 45. Bissell, in my opinion, did not destroy the report, and there's a document I find that confirms that to me. And an exceptional direct witness, one of the members of the International Medical Commission, was a native-born U.S. citizen. Yes, I said that. He was born in the States, in California, brought back to Croatia, and then returned to the United States after he completed his medical studies, and he is the father of CIS in the United States. And he was part of that International Medical Commission. So Julius Epstein publishes these articles, or they're published by the Herald Tribune on July 3rd and 4th, and Harry Thomas Schultz, professor of English at Dartmouth, writes to him and says, there were these guys who were in an offlog with me, and they were taken off to Katyn, and you might want to locate them. And this then starts the whole thread rolling. So, Colonel Frank Stevenson, born in South Africa, taken prisoner in 42. Stanley Gilder, Scottish physician, taken prisoner in 1940. He's held in Rottweil. Lieutenant Colonel John H. Van Vliet, Jr., U.S. Army, and Captain Donald B. Stewart. I did not mention his son, Bob Stewart, is with us here tonight, and I thank him for coming up to be present at this lecture. The two of them were taken prisoner together, and they were in the same camp, in the same Auflock 9AZ in Rottenburg. Frank Strubent was a civilian internee from Guernsey. And then there were these three men whose names I did not know until November 2013 when I found the document in Washington, which, by the by, had been declassified as far back as 1974, but nobody knew. So you're looking at the back of John Van Vliet. This is Frank Strubent. This is Dr. Boots. This is Captain Dr. Stanley Gilder. This is Frank Parker Stevenson, same rank as Van Vliet, and he's reserved. He's not a career officer as Van Vliet is, but he becomes nominally the senior officer of the group, and that's a question as to why. This is Donald B. Stewart, and the 1, 2, 3, those are the caps of the other ranks. Stanley Gilder is seen speaking to Dr. Boots because he spoke German, and he obviously knew from medicine. And they decided that, as Frank Stevenson says, that it was decided that he should be the one to communicate with. And this is Frank Stevenson in Australia. He has some sort of a breakdown when he comes back, when they're brought back from Katyn, where they spent 2 days, to Berlin, and he starts saying, "Oh, I'm going to publish a book. I'm going to write about this." And the Germans immediately take him away. And all of the POW records don't show where he was for a period of 2 months. He disappears from the planet for 2 months. And then suddenly in mid-August, we find out that he's in this Camp 19 in Bologna. And so, in South Africa, in a folder containing a report that the British government still denies, says it doesn't exist, but it was written by Frank Stevenson and submitted to MI9, MI6, blah, 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 were these images. It's the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Dormition. And why am I showing you a photograph of the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Dormition in Smolensk? What does this do? Well, I'm going to go a bit forward. That's the photograph when I went to Guernsey that I found in an old suitcase that contained Frank Strubent's papers. It's clear that these photographs were taken from various points driving around the city of Smolensk. And for me, this served, aside from the book that Frank Strubent wrote, and the fact that it is mentioned, his name is mentioned in some other places, that he really was there, and he was there with the POWs that we were referring to. So, that is Frank Parker Stevenson. Dr. Gilder is taken prisoner way down near Calais. He's held in Rottweil, which is point B, and then he is brought to Berlin. It's interesting that in his report, which was known, he wrote that we were trying to decide among the three of us who should go to Katyn. And Gory was able to send short burst messages, radio messages, and so we decided that I should go. And I said to myself, and I keep on saying, why would Gilder note that Gory could write send these kind of messages if he was writing a report for MI9, which clearly knew that Gory could write, or rather send those kind of messages? That's still a question to be answered. So Frank Strubent gets taken a POW, as not a POW, he's an internee, technically speaking, because the British arrested the Germans who were in Persia, in Iran. And as a result, the islands of Jersey, Guernsey, Sark, which lie 30 miles or whatever off the coast of France, they were seized by the Germans, and these guys were taken in. Frank Struben, by the by, issued a book, which we'll talk about later. It only came out in the late 1960s, and I've not been able to find a record on it. The British are not forthcoming, but I believe he published it that late because he was censored. He was not allowed to publish it. So, Donald Stewart, John Van Vliet, the Battle of Sidi Bin Suud, Kasserine Pass, or the Suda rather. Sometime some of you must have read about those. It's the first great defeat of the U.S. Army in the North African campaign. General Fred Lander, I believe his name was, doesn't even bother to go out and look at the battle site. He plans the entire battle from his tent by looking at maps. Problematical. Donald Stewart. His column number. Columns are a series of numerations which allow you to identify West Point officers. Every West Point graduate receives a column number. Graduates West Point in 1940. Gets thrown out into the battlefield real fast. And he's taken POW on February 15th. Auflage 9AZ and then Auflage 64. We'll talk about Auflage 64. He's the first person to testify in front of the Madden Committee, which was a special committee formed by the House of Representatives under the chairmanship of Representative Madden as a result of that little stone that was started by Julius Epstein. That little stone started rolling and gathered storm. And this is a photograph of him in the Auflage. In 1981, there was a student from Claremont McKenna, I believe it was called, college, who did his master's thesis as a video project, probably one of the first video projects. And this is a quote. It's the only film that we have with Donald Stewart where he is speaking about Katyn, and he talks about his reactions to the smell. When you read about Katyn, nobody really talks about how bad it was. A couple of the writers, the journalists writing about January of 1944 talk about it. And this photograph of Donald Stewart helps us understand how they decided that it was the Soviet guilt. The Germans said this, that, the other, and he said, we came up and they brought us up and we could see their boots. The way they were lined up, what we were looking at were their boots. And we'd heard that Polish officers had these great, fantastic boots. And there were these boots, and they were in pristine condition. And he says, look at my shoes. These are shoes that I wore for 18 months. If these guys, as the Russians claim, had worn their boots for 18 months, here, this is broken. Look at how my heel is worn down. Look at how the leather is cracked. It's impossible that they could have worn these boots for 18 months. We never talked about this in front of the Germans, and it was only when we were back in Berlin and they would take us out for walks and we could get out a little bit aside that we would speak to each other, because they were firmly convinced that every room they were in had mics in it and that they were being recorded. And he said that's when we came to the conclusion, each of us separately and individually, that the boots proved the timeline. John Van Vliet, his great-grandfather was a West Pointer. His father was a West Pointer. He's sent to Britain to investigate the possible locations of U.S. Army bases in 1941, in June. The United States isn't talking about going into a war, but he's there, he's been sent, and he's been frocked, means attired, as a full colonel, because he's going to be negotiating with people at that level, and that's how his passport is issued, as a colonel, not a lieutenant colonel. He comes back and he's at the infantry school, becomes a POW. He is basically the second person to testify in front of the Madden Committee. The reason Donald Stewart testified in October of '51 was he was going to be on his way to Korea. They wanted to get him, they didn't want to have to bring him back. John Van Vliet is there and he has to be brought back. And so the Madden Committee hearings really begin formally in February of '52. But at no time does he ever mention that he submitted sworn testimony in Paris at Sheikh headquarters to an officer of the War Crimes Investigation Unit. And this is an image from the same film made by Roy Towers. So, as I said, these prisoners are brought to Berlin, Rottenburg on Fulda, Rottweil, Laufen on the border of Germany, 3 British other ranks, and 4 U.S. rank and files. They're interrogated. Each of them says, we're not going to collaborate. This is a political thing you're doing. We're not here for politics. They ask Stevenson to sign a document called a parole, which means that they're not going to try to escape. He, a senior officer, attests to this. He says, I'm not signing this. As a result, the 4 Americans are sent back to the camp. They're replaced by 4 German guards, and they fly out the next day. They fly via Breslau, Wrocław. They pick up a journalist there. They then fly over Warsaw. And they say, we couldn't really see the buildings, but we saw the chimneys. What they saw was the smoke of the ghetto burning. Dr. Tramson, who was a member of the International Medical Commission and had gone through 2 weeks earlier, he writes directly, we saw the ghetto burning. They land in Biała Podlaska, and in that Roy Towers film, at one point, it's in the draft version that Mr. Towers let me have. I forget whether it's Donald Stewart who says it to John Van Vliet, or Van Vliet says it to Stewart. He says, remember, we got a hard-boiled egg. We got a real hard-boiled egg in Biała Podlaska. And then they fly on to Smolensk, and they spent 2 days there. One of the people who accompanied them on that plane and on that trip was George Alfred Schmidt von Johnson. Born outside of Poznan, spent some time in Germany, grew up in the Galveston area, attended Rice Institute, and in 1935 returned to Munich, and in his biographical application to the University of Munich, he writes, I knew that my heart belonged to Germany, and I always knew I would be here. And in their testimony to the Madden Committee, they said he spoke colloquial American English. So they spent 2 days in Katyn. They come back to Berlin. The other ranks, the 3 men and Frank Strubent, are immediately sent back to where they came from. Frank Stevenson, as I said, is separated from the group. They hold the others there for a bit longer, and then they return to Rottweil and to Rottenburg. During this time period, according to the Hague Convention, every national group has to be held separately, and the camp in Shubin, which had previously been an off-lot for British officers, is converted to serve as the first U.S. Army officers off-lot, and that's where they take them. Van Vliet says, when Professor Zabodny, who's the author of a book called Death in the Forest, which was the first real book in English on the subject back in the 50s as a master's thesis and published later, He says, we thought that they were going to send us over the border to Spain because we couldn't say anything and appear on German radio or on film, but if they had dumped us over the border in Spain, they could have then said something. But apparently, decisions had changed in Berlin. And it's confirmed by a Japanese coded message that was broken by the Navy code breakers, in which the Japanese ambassador in Berlin advises headquarters that Hitler has now dropped the idea of attempting to broker a truce with Britain and the United States and to split them off from Soviet Russia, that in fact he's going to broker peace with Soviet Russia and continue the war with Britain and just occupy all Western Europe. Never heard about it from the Germans once we got back to the camp. Now, what have I discovered in these past years? Well, before the book was published, I discovered Stevenson's report in South Africa, and I have to publicly state that I'm indebted to the help of any number of people, including archivists, who remember my pleas and respond to them. But after that, the archivist in South Africa sent me something about a year ago. It was a coded message that had been sent out from Rothenburg and reached London before my boys had made it to Katyn. It said they are on their way to Katyn. They are currently in Berlin. So the British knew. And what was found was the memo that the British sent, which also went to the American military intelligence people. So the Americans immediately knew. Additionally, all of the officers had submitted protests to the Swiss protecting powers. Now those take time to get through, but this was an immediate information and they knew. Van Vliet and Stewart, as I said, had learned to use code from the British. The British had taught their officers how to write in code. The Americans had not. And in Schubing, in 1943, they sent letters to the United States which confirmed Soviet guilt for the crime of Katyn. And those letters got through. They were in Washington. The United States chose not to acknowledge their existence. After the Burdenko Commission, the United States military intelligence people write to them in this Auflage in Schubing, and they ask, what about this? What about that? And they write back and they say, it is the Russians that are responsible. That is one of the letters that I found in late August 2012, was a response to the Burdenko Commission question. And then there's the Paris deposition that I mentioned. When Van Vliet escapes from the camp in Buchenwald, and we'll talk about that in a minute, he gets to Paris, he makes this sworn deposition. It's taken by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hoffman, who has to be an attorney. I can't find a record of him in JAG. Nobody knows who he is. And he is part of war crimes investigation. There were 4 copies of the report. The only copy that has survived is the shaved copy. And that's where Van Vliet gives the names of the 3 other ranks, gives the name of Major Dr. Václav Sieniewicz, and he mentions the 3 camps. Americans never mentioned Putyvl ever, and Starobiec was only mentioned by scholars starting like in about the 60s. For him to mention that in 45 means he really saw a document, and these were probably the transit points that Sieniewicz had been brought through. So, this map shows where point B, which is Bydgoszcz, Schubing is right near Bydgoszcz, they are marched out, all of the officers from Auflage 64 in February of 1945. And it takes over 2 months for them to go north northwest, and they end up on the island of Usedom, which is where Peenemünde is located. Anybody know Peenemünde? Okay. There the group is split in two. Healthy officers and ill. And I've talked to the stewards and to John Van Vliet III, and everybody's in concurrence that it was a conscious decision for what happened. David Donald Stewart went off with the healthy officers. Van Vliet was assigned as commanding officer, as senior officer for the group of ill officers. They knew that American bombers were strafing the roads. By splitting into two, effectively, or going separate ways, they increased the probability that one of them would survive. And they both end up in camps near Berlin. Stewart ends up in Hammelburg, and Van Vliet ends up in Luckenwald. This is a great photograph of Donald Stewart during training maneuvers, and I just wanted everybody to know that in the 1930s, West Point was still training their officers on horseback. So, Van Vliet, and I will speak more about Van Vliet today simply because he's the one who becomes, at this point, more, how shall I, apparent. He flees Luckenwald. He's got the photographs. The Germans gave them photographs of the bodies of them standing over the grave pits, the massacre pits, and they were all stamped as censored, which meant that whenever they were searched, no other German officer would remove that from them. And so he's got the photographs. He's got his notes on what he saw in Katyn. He doesn't want the Soviets to find them with this. I mean, he knows he's going to be chopped chicken liver if they find this. So he escapes, liberates the bicycle, and heads over to the 104 Division. I've searched the records of the military officer for the 104th for that time period, or I've attempted to search it. All of the records for the time period when Van Vliet would have gotten there are missing. They're not in the files of the 104 military intelligence officer. That officer, however, gets him to Leipzig, where he meets General Collins. Remember, General Collins served under his father, so he knew John Van Vliet when he was wearing practically diapers. And so he agrees to see him, he shows him the photographs, and he gives them the full skiboo on what he saw in Katyn. The other guys, he says, I only gave them a rundown. Then he is sent on to Paris to get back to the United States on the first plane possible. And there are two possibilities. One is that the war crimes officer was not aware of the decision made that the Soviets would prosecute all war crimes that took place on their territory, which effectively meant there could be no prosecution, no real prosecution of Katyn, because they would have to be prosecuting themselves. So either this officer didn't know this and thought that there would be a real prosecution of the crime, and he took the report from Van Vliet, or else Van Vliet was so insistent that he wanted to make a report that the guy took the report from him. And that would have meant that Van Vliet wanted to make the report because he was afraid getting on a plane in 1945. It's not like getting on a plane in 2014. Things happened. So we didn't know about all of these other things. We did know about the report of Stanley Gilder from November of 44. I discovered the report of Stevenson from 45. We keep on moving to a period earlier and earlier. In 1946, somebody in South Africa must know that Stevenson has been there, and he asks in Parliament, were any officers of the South African Union Defense Forces present in Katyn? No, says the Deputy Defense Minister. And of course, at the Nuremberg trial, only the Burdenko Commission report was submitted. By the by, you should be aware that Justice Jackson knew very clearly what the facts were. General Clay sent him a report prepared by people in Warsaw who had spoken to their local contacts, and he writes, none of the local contacts of our people believe that the Germans were responsible for Katyn. So Justice Jackson knew, but he never said a word. This is the report of Frank Parker Stevenson, and that's the 7 pages, the first and last page of that 7-page report. And he states clearly, I did this because Brigadier so-and-so and so-and-so wanted. Now, the Madden Committee is coming to Europe. They are going to conduct hearings. The British Embassy in Washington sends a message to London, says they want to talk to Stevenson, Strubent, and Gilder, which means the Madden Committee knew who these guys were. They had all the names. Strubent's name is never mentioned in the testimony. And a decision is made, and please look. It's not a good pasted, but you can see it's addressed to Lieutenant Colonel F.P. Stevenson, address unknown. The British refused to give them the address. The letter is dated April 15th. They met with the Foreign Office representatives that day, submitted that letter. I believe that there were letters to Gilder and to Strubent as well. They were not delivered to them because these two men were British citizens, while Stevenson was a South African citizen, a separate country. What did the British do? They held on to the letter until the end of June, then forwarded it on to South Africa House. And South Africa House got it literally on, it was sent on Friday. On Monday, South Africa House was sending it to Stevenson. And Stevenson immediately says, I want to testify. But of course, the Madden Committee has left Europe at that point, and it's too late. So, John Van Vliet gets to Washington. It's either May 22nd or May 23rd. He submits a report to General Bissell. That report disappears. When Epstein writes his article, people start looking for that report. They can't find it. The report is reproduced. He recreates it in 1950. It is stated it is the original, it's identical to the original report. But it isn't. It doesn't mention the sworn deposition in Paris, and it doesn't mention the coded letters. And I believe that the original report would have contained references to that. That's Ray Madden, the chair of the committee, Roman Buczynski, who was later a congressman from Chicago, who was an investigator, and these are two members of the committee. Their testimony, cumulatively, Stewart's and Van Vliet's, is the longest testimony of any of the witnesses that appeared before the Madden Committee. And again, neither of them mentions the coded letters in that testimony. So, post-1960, what happens? Van Vliet's retired. Stewart's still in the Army, so he can't talk about things. Van Vliet writes this article. 4.5 million people by the Auditing Bureau read that article. 1981, they're both retired, and Roy Towers finds them and makes his film. Professor Wadley makes a audio recording with them in '84. Gilder writes his recollections for a book published by a fellow prisoner, and he writes, that's the only time he writes something in public, or for public consumption. His widow, whom I located, found a 1950 10-page report that he wrote at that period in time. In 1988, as I said, Stewart had died much earlier, Van Vliet meets Professor Zabodny in Omaha, Nebraska, and he records an oral interview. He talks about Katyn, and he breaks down during the interview, 44 years afterwards. He doesn't talk about the coded letters. He doesn't talk about the sworn deposition. He then makes there's a film made by Witold Sadrowski, and he is interviewed for that film. Andrzej Sikora, or Andrew Sikora, who lives here in Kansas, interviews him in 1991. And the final thing is his U.S. Army Oral History Project. And it's the only time he literally insists that he wants to talk about Katyn, and he forces them at the very end. There's about 10 minutes talking about Katyn. And just before that, he talks about writing coded letters. But he never says, I sent coded letters about Katyn. That never appears in that film. So, when I said Van Vliet broke down in the interview with Zawodny, he said that when he left Katyn, the smell had so permeated his clothes that even though they took them to the officers' mess to feed them, and they were getting clearly much better food than they had gotten as POWs, that for 2 days he wasn't able to eat. That in fact the food on the plate looked like the fluids that were emanating from the bodies of the victims, which hadn't all mummified in those 3 years. Jackie Van Vliet talks about her father breaking down and having nightmares. Maybe if they had lived till the year 2000, there would have been a different opportunity for them to speak more openly. Maybe documents would have been declassified. But it's clear that they were not able to speak publicly the way they wanted to. Stewart appeared in front of the Polish-American Congress as keynote speaker a number of times and spoke about the issue of Katyn. As long as he could while he was alive, he did make public attestations, and so did Van Vliet. I think I didn't break the timeline. Thank you for your attention. And if you want to go on, I have a blog which is called Researching Katyn, and I'm slowly trying to chronicle things there. You can read that. And if you have a question, you can write to me. So you have a question from the